We are excited to feature, as supporters of this episode of the podcast, two of our generous community members, Brian Mann and Rebecca Wald, both of whom would like you to know that they're vegetarian and sponsoring this episode about meat and Jewish history nonetheless. If you'd like to sponsor an episode of Judaism Unbound, you can be in touch via hello@judaismunbound.com.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 488, Meat, the Key to Jewish History. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're continuing to explore the terrain we started last week, looking at Jewish history through the topic of meat. What happens when we shift our focus on the Jewish past from things like rabbis and sacred texts to the centerpiece of many Jewish meals? That's what we're discussing today, building on the conversation we had last time with Jordan Rosenblum that asked what we can learn about Judaism from the topic of pigs. Our guest today is John Efron, author of the book All-Consuming: Germans, Jews, and the Meaning of Meat. We'll explore with him how so many things, from medieval Jewish history to the Enlightenment to Shabtai Tzvi to the rise of the Nazis, can all be understood more fully when we look at the role that meat held in all those eras. Before we get into it, an announcement that we promised last week, and one that I'm especially excited about. A new podcast in Judaism Unbound's family of podcasts has been born, and we're thrilled to announce its arrival. It's The Oral Talmud, hosted by me, Dan, and longtime friend of Judaism Unbound and our very first guest ever, B'nai Lappi, the founder and Rosh Yeshiva of Svara, a traditionally radical yeshiva. On this podcast, you can join the two of us in our study partnership, our Chavruta, in which we explore the Talmud through the traditionally radical lens pioneered by B'nai Lappi, and the lens that converted me from a Talmud skeptic to a Talmud enthusiast. Together, we explore key stories and other material from the Talmud as a how-to manual for reimagining Judaism after the previous version crashes, in B'nai Lappi's terminology. We also interview some of the leading Talmud scholars of our time, including professors and teachers whose ideas help us gain a deeper understanding of what the ancient rabbis were up to when they redesigned Judaism after the destruction of the temple. If you're a beginner to Talmud study, we think that this podcast will be very accessible to you, will be interesting for you, will help you see the value of Talmud that you might not have seen before, as I did. And if you're a longtime learner of Talmud, we think there's going to be a lot that surprises you, because we ourselves are often surprised by what we dig out from the text. We just dropped the trailer for the Oral Talmud, which you can access in any of your favorite podcast listening apps. Just search for Oral Talmud. And we'll start releasing full episodes on June 23rd. You can learn more about the Oral Talmud at oraltalmud.com. Another important reminder, it is your last chance, your very last chance to submit your application for Judaism Unbound's certificate program in Unbound Judaism, an ongoing course of study offered through our Unyeshiva Digital Center for Jewish Learning and Unlearning. As we release today's episode, there are only 2 days left for you to apply, so don't wait. Head to judaismunbound.com/certificate to get your application materials and submit them. The deadline is Sunday, June 22nd, so you should submit your application for the certificate program and then spend the next day listening to the first episodes of the Oral Talmud. What a great week you might be able to have. And now a bit more about our guest today, John Efron. John Efron is the Koret Professor of Jewish History at the University of California at Berkeley, where he's a specialist in the cultural and social history of German Jewry. A native of Melbourne, Australia, he has a BA from Monash University, and he studied at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, as well as receiving an MA from New York University and a PhD from Columbia University. John Efron's other books include Medicine and the German Jews, A History, and The Jews, A Modern History. His most recent book, All-Consuming: Germans, Jews, and the Meaning of Meat, is a cultural history of the role of meat in German Jewish history from the medieval period until today. And while that might seem kind of niche, as you'll see, it opens up a lot of big ideas. So without further ado, let's talk about it. John Efron, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I wanted to start with the experience of a historian when they are deciding what their next book is going to be. And, I think a lot of us who think about what historians write about, it's like wars and discoveries of new continents and whatnot, things of that nature. And I'm wondering, like, when you end up writing a book about food or about, Jews and specific Jews in Germany and meat, is that because that's what you set out to do? Or did you set out on some other project and somehow this reveals itself?
I did set out on another project, and that was to write a history of German Jewry through the prism of the 5 human senses. And I started with smell. I had a handle on those sources. But as I was writing that chapter, I began to really worry a lot about the other 4 chapters, because it's a nice idea for a book, if I say so myself, but when it comes to sight, is it what they saw? Is it how they were seen? Same with hearing. You'll get a lot of, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? And I found it not really doable. But I was interested in the chapter that I did work on smell actually had to do with a statue that appears in Germany called the Judensau, which means the Jewish sow or the Jewish pig. It's a medieval representation of Jews suckling at the teats of pigs. Now, all of the medieval accusations hurled at Jews, whether it's ritual murder or host desecration or well poisoning throughout the Black Death, those are all European-wide. There's nothing specific about Germany with those charges. However, the Judensau, for the most part, only appears in German lands. We don't really know why. Once it was depicted after the advent of print, then the images, because you can do so much more in print, became ever more extreme and ever more vile. Jews are depicted eating the waste of the pig. And what interested me about that was the fact they are never seen eating the flesh of the pig. They're not seen as consuming that which is taboo for Jews, but they are seen consuming that which is taboo for all humans. So that deprives them of their humanity. So that's what started me thinking about meat in general, the possibility of pursuing this further. And the more I looked into it, I just came up with just a huge amount of sources in different genres in a way that no other country can really compete in terms of having spent so much time thinking about Jews and meat like Germany. I started with this chapter on the Judensau, which is not in the book. I actually removed it, but nonetheless, that's what set this thing in train. But I was very well aware of the campaign against kosher slaughter in the 19th century, and there in Germany, it was more long-lived, more determined, more dogged, more obsessive, in fact, than almost anywhere else. It seemed to me that there is a real story here to tell, and it's a story that hasn't been told. There's some work done in the ancient period and some stuff done on pig. My colleague Jordan Rosenblum has recently written on this. An approach in food history is to take one particular commodity. So there are histories of, bananas and cinnamon and milk and oranges and lemons and all sorts of things like that. Nothing like that really has been attempted in Jewish historiography, and particularly for the modern period. There is some work, for example, on the Talmud and food and things like that, but nothing really that veers into the modern period. It seemed to me that not only is there a story there, but it's a story worth telling.
Yeah, I mean, for whatever set of reasons, I always find myself gravitating towards forms of telling history that feel surprising when I compare them to what I learned in like 8th grade or high school history class. Like it's not that my teachers ever said to me, and I'm not speaking for me, I think a lot of us, what we learn growing up is sort of history refers to studying about people from the past who had power and sometimes had conflicts with each other over that power. Usually men, usually white folks, like that's by and large what is most commonly taught. And, thank goodness we've turned things a little in recent generations. But I think that it is still the case that people are less likely to say, yes, the kitchen, that's a place where history happens. Or, yes, the butcher shop, that's a place where history happens, as opposed to a hall of power at City Hall or Supreme Court. Like those are places where it's like, yes, the things that happen here will one day be in history books. But I think that the lens you bring is like, okay, so what if the butcher was telling the history story? What if like generations of butchers from the Middle Ages to now were saying what Jewish history was? We would get something like this. And it's not that that's the fullness of history, but it is a really key angle on history when most of what we received is sort of what rabbis in that time period or other time periods would say about Jewish history. So I'm grateful to you for that. I want to get nitty gritty. I want to talk about like some meat stuff. Like I say that as a vegetarian myself, which we'll talk about maybe later, but like I do want to go there, and I want to start in a place that really did surprise me. I mean, in your book, there's a lot of things about, as you've already touched on, relationships between German non-Jews, largely German Christians, and German Jews, and how that plays out in the realm of meat, lots of anti-Semitism. That I was expecting, given the time period we're describing and the place we're describing. What I was less expecting was actually right from the get-go in your book and right at the conclusion, as sort of bookends.
Yes.
We see a little bit about positive ways in which meat is providing contexts for Jews to like connect and bond with non-Jews. And what I'm referring to is at the beginning, you have this section about how, I mean, here's where we get down and dirty. Jews don't eat a very particular part of meat, the sciatic nerve. I'll let you talk about why. And that led them to, as sort of part of the process regularly, create a kind of agreement with Christian butchers that they'll sell them this part that Jews don't eat. So they'll get to have, money from that and not have to waste a huge amount of the meat that's sort of adjacent to the sciatic nerve. And the Christian butchers benefit because they have access to this from others without, they have more access to this body part. And then at the end of the book, you have this piece about Jews and Muslims connecting in the realm of hostility towards kosher slaughter and also halal slaughter in contemporary periods. So can you talk to us a little about how, sort of counterintuitively, there are these ways in which looking at meat can show us not only how Jews have been separate from other groups, but actually intermingled with them?
Okay, so one of the things that really surprised me that I didn't expect, and I had a particular view of the Middle Ages that is not entirely, incorrect. I mean, it was pretty rough, to put it mildly. But I was very surprised is that medieval meat markets were very, very highly regulated places. Just a raft of laws and decrees. And what I was surprised about in Germany was that more often than not, Jews were not disadvantaged according to the laws that were laid down. The laws were sometimes designed explicitly to foster good relations, to make it possible for Jewish butchers and Christian butchers to earn a living in what is a highly competitive business. I mean, if you have a meat market, basically every stall virtually is selling the same stuff. So it's hard to earn a living. There were a few places in Germany where Jews were not allowed to sell meat, but they were really in the minority. But Jewish law itself also contributed to the situation. How so? And you've alluded to it, but the dietary laws are, by and large, a mechanism by which to separate Jews from non-Jews since the beginning. But that separation, ironically, also has the power to bring people together, Christians and Jews together. So as you alluded to, because of a passage in Genesis talking about Jacob wrestling with the angel and he was hit on the hip, we're forbidden from eating the sciatic nerve and the meat around the sciatic nerve. And it's very difficult to porge, nikur in Hebrew, or treiben in Yiddish, to remove the sciatic nerve. It's done in Israel, but pretty much everywhere else, and still in the diaspora, it's not taken out. But you can't throw away a third of a cow. That's not viable. And so those portions, stuff like rump steak, for example, or T-bone steak, those kinds of things, those portions are sold to non-Jews. So that works to the advantage of the Jewish butcher who has to sell these portions of meat, and it works to the advantage of the Christian customer because the marketplace sort of would dictate the price, pushes the prices down. So essentially, there's this act of mutual economic codependency between Jewish butchers and Christian customers. and that works out all to the good. So you have the laws on the one hand that are handed down by the non-Jewish authorities, and then you have Jewish law, halakha, on the other hand, and they both contribute to the fact that this object that is designed to keep, in some respects, Jews and other ethnic groups apart can actually bring the parties together. And also, this operates on two planes. There's the theological plane. So the church repeatedly forbade Christians from eating with Jews. Well, it's not just a one-way street. It's not just from the Jewish side. So the church admonished Christians not to eat the meat of the Jews, especially those parts of the animals that the Jews themselves reject. But in the marketplace, all of those theological admonitions were honored in the breach. And so I address those views of the church vis-a-vis Jewish meat, but it has to be weighed against the reality of the marketplace, where Christians do eat the meat of the Jews.
I'd love to explore another angle that you bring in. I mean, there's a particular moment in your book that I loved, this little poem that arose, and I think it's a few hundred years after what we're describing. We're going to hop around time periods for the listeners out there. We're in the 1600s, I think, and there's this poem which, for me, immediately enters into sort of a mental catalog I have of Jews across time complaining that their fellow Jews don't do enough Judaism. This is something that comes up all over the place. And for us looking at, 21st century America, it is helpful to let people know that, it might not be unique to our time period that all these folks look around and have this nostalgic lens of the past. And they think, a few generations ago, all the Jews were so pious and we're going to synagogue, and now people don't go, and now people don't keep kosher, and like all of these things. When you actually look, what is interesting about the relationship to Jewish practice over time is not that, we've been on this eternal march away from Jewish practice, but rather at almost every stage, we've been stating that things used to be better and that, everybody's apathetic now. And so there's this poem. I'll pass it to you because you know the poem I'm hinting at. Take us into this soliloquy poem on why we Jews at the time are not investing enough in Jewish ritual practice and instead seem very interested in meat.
So one of the themes in the book is obviously meat related, and that is that in Germany and actually in Switzerland into the 20th century, there were a very significant number of Jewish cattle dealers. That was a very common trade. And so there's a poem in the book, a 17th century Yiddish poem by a Polish Jew, Yudah Leib Moses ben of Zelachov, who wrote about these cattle dealers and saw them as almost like heathens.
Take us in.
And they talk a lot of nonsense and foolishness about business and merchandise, about cattle, horses, oxen, and cows, also about sheep, lambs, and goats. As soon as they get up out of bed in the morning, they run to the barn to see which beast is skinny and which beast is fat. And before they even take a tallis and tefillin in their hands, they first approach the animal to grasp and feel it. And as Shabbos comes to a close, in synagogue they have recited Havdalah, the Sabbath's closing ceremony. There lies the animal already bound and maltreated, and they don't even wait until shul is over to drag the shochet out of his house. This is interesting because it's a view of a Polish Jew of what he considers to be the laxity of German Jews.
Oh.
And there's another instance in the book where a Polish rabbi warns Polish Jews not to eat with German Jews because the level of kashrut is not to his liking, which is still a very, very common thing among people who keep kosher as well. One person's hechsher is good, but for other people, that same hechsher can be virtually treif.
Well, along those lines, I was curious, we speculate about some of this stuff a lot, or at least I do, and rarely have a chance to check my speculations with an actual historian who might know. But when I think about keeping kosher in the Jewish past, and here I'm talking about before the Enlightenment, and really since your work goes all the way back to the Middle Ages, I mean, the Jews were not wealthy. Most Jews were not wealthy in these times. So there are things that when you ask somebody today what it looks like to keep kosher, they will often say, right, you have to have multiple dishes, meat and dairy, and also the same for Passover, and different pots, and so much. And it just strikes me that it would have been impossible for most Jews throughout most of Jewish history to have a kitchen like that. And that makes me wonder what it looked like to keep kosher in that period, let's say the Middle Ages, or maybe there are other times that you would say are better to investigate. I guess, like, what were the lines of demarcation? I mean, were there people back then who were saying, you really have to spend your last penny to buy extra dishes because that's what we do as Jews? Or there was more of a sense of like, no, that keeping kosher was I guess I'm asking, how did they keep kosher back in those days?
Well, obviously the kitchens are not like modern kitchens, just in terms of space and layout, and of course the economic capacity of Jewish families to double up on everything, crockery and cutlery, is virtually impossible. And of course, the idea that one would have two ovens, for example, is an impossibility. I do talk in the book about rules concerning cooking, let's say, meat dishes and dairy dishes in the same oven, and whether the qualities of one food are imparted to the next dish that's cooked. If there's a dairy dish that's baked in an oven, how does that affect if you're putting meat in the oven thereafter, and how long one has to wait? It's probably unlikely that many people were able to have two sets of everything. So as we approach the modern period, and by which I mean the 18th century, there is sort of an increased ability, especially in Central Europe, to sort of double up on everything in the kitchen. The kitchen, to get back to something that Dan said before, I mean, the kitchen is the locus of sort of power, as it were, in terms of the power to transmit Judaism. It's very much a domestic religion, right? It plays out in the home, and there's nothing more elemental than food. One of the reasons for the book is to highlight, in some ways, there is one chapter that is dedicated to food and cookbooks and things like that, and it's to highlight this particular space and the role that it plays in the transmission of Jewish culture. It doesn't necessarily have to be an exercise in orthopraxy, but nonetheless, the Jewish calendar dictates that one eats certain foods at certain times, and certain seasonal dishes that are appropriate to this festival or that festival. And those are all codified in Germany for the very first time, because Germany is the first place where kosher cookbooks are published. And all of those cookbooks, I should add, begin with instructions on how to lay out the Jewish kitchen, and that you do need two sets of everything. So we have sort of written textual evidence, what the ideal kitchen would be, would look like, what its layout would look like.
I'd love to do a little bit of a case study of, for me, just sort of the core muscle that your book repeatedly exercises or flexes, which is, I mean, as you said, it started as a book that was looking at German Jewish history through the realm of the five senses. It became a book looking at German Jewish history through the realm specifically of meat. And what that means is you hear about a number of key pivotal moments in the flow of European Jewish history, and you get the angles that are most tied to meat, which is interesting because when I hear, for example, about Shabtai Tzvi, about this claimed Messiah figure. We've spoken about Shabtai Tzvi in the past. We've spoken about Jacob Frank, a follower figure. We've had a variety of guests on that front, including some that wanna think about some positively heretical sides of those figures, in addition to the problematic sides. But what is really interesting is you take on that moment and you notice there's actually a key part of this conversation that relates to how folks related to meat. And so you talk about how a particular figure, and I'll let you tell this story, is accused of being a Sabbatean. Yeah. This is after Shabtai Tzvi by a little while. He's accused of that, and it relates to how he may or may not be relating to, again, that sciatic nerve. I guess that's something I'm really interested in today. But like, can you take us into that situation and maybe how this might work in other kinds of key pivotal Jewish moments as well?
So I think you're referring to Jonathan Eibeschutz.
Yes.
Okay, whose great nemesis was Yaakov Emden, both from northern Germany, rabbis in northern Germany, and Emden accused Eibeschutz of being a Sabbatean. What is pertinent to this discussion is that Eibeschutz, and this is little known, was an expert menaker, that is to say, someone who could purge the sciatic nerve, skilled in very intricate butchery and kosher butchery, as it were. He describes an incident where someone came to him and who was also a menaker, a purger. And as far as Eibeschutz was concerned, he displayed that he didn't really know what he was talking about. And Eibeschutz used that opportunity to assert his own credentials and also assert that he would only eat meat that he trusted.
That he himself, not he this other
himself.
Guy. Yeah.
And
the ultimate power play. I'm the only legitimate hechsher. Like, this is the most stringent hechsher you could possibly come up with.
I mean, you don't trust anybody else. Obviously, this is where, in extreme cases, adherence to kashrut can take you, that you don't trust anyone else. That actually brings me to one other thing, if I may. In the Middle Ages, Jewish society is divided into sort of, three tiers, and you have rabbis and scholars in the first tier, and the second tier are sort of synagogue functionaries and criers and beadles and things like that, the shamas. And then the third would be bakers, but butchers as well. Now, what's interesting about the butcher, as far as I could see after having written this, and this I think still applies to this very day, Jewish communities put a hell of a lot of trust in someone whom they accorded very little honor. They are completely dependent. We go to a kosher butcher today, and they just have to take it on trust that meat is completely kosher. Now, there have been instances when that has not been the case, and we know that, and that comes as a tremendous shock to the community in all sorts of ways, a real violation of trust.
Right. I think there was a story about a restaurant, maybe in Israel, where somebody who had an allergy to dairy went to this meat restaurant and died because of this allergy to dairy, and it only could have been because it wasn't actually kosher.
Right. So, number of instances with this. I mean, relatively recently. I don't remember exactly how long ago. I mean, there was the case of the abattoir in Iowa, of course, and then kashrut now gets expanded to include perhaps the treatment of animals themselves, and does that render the animal kosher or not kosher if they've been mistreated and things like that, or the workers themselves. Actually, these were sort of immigrant workers who were working in this kosher slaughterhouse. But anyway, it's an interesting position that the community back then in the Middle Ages and still to this day place their trust in the butcher. As you know, there's no hierarchy of kosher. Something is kosher or it's not kosher. Something is treif or it's not treif. So there's no technical difference between, a non-kosher steak or a pork chop. But meat is different as a substance. Meat is different, so I have there's a section in the book where we talk about someone who consumes non-kosher meat for the very first time. And that is a sort of culinary Rubicon that one crosses. That in a way, let's say if you have milk that is not chalav Yisrael, that is not technically kosher, it just doesn't have the same impact of putting meat in your mouth. That's more than just a culinary moment. It's a psychological moment. It's a deeply intimate moment because it's something that you're ingesting, and you're ingesting something that had to be killed in order for you to have this particular item, this product. So it occupies a place of really deep bodily intimacy when you ingest it. Placing one's trust in the butcher is not done lightly.
So that's really, really cool. And I do want to get the ending to that Eibeschutz Emden story, because where we were is that Eibeschutz was a skilled porger, but we didn't get to sort of the accusations that he was porging incorrectly, which gets nice and spicy. And, we love some Jewish infighting on this show in any era. So I'd love if you could take us into how that ends, and maybe, again, just what it reflects about how looking at meat in Jewish history isn't just some side effort, but actually can help us better understand key pivotal moments in Jewish history.
Well, as far as the conclusion to the story goes, Emden went so far as to demand that Eiberschutz and his followers be expelled from Altona, which is a small town near Hamburg, because he was a Sabbatian, and that he had caused his disciples to sin and stumble by sending them meat that he had deveined, which they ate, according to Emden, until it came out of their nostrils. And what was really wrong with it is that it was full of the fat of the Gid HaNasheh, the sciatic nerve, just as Shabbatai Tzvi had done. So Emden said that one of the many transgressions of Shabbatai Tzvi is that he had consumed the Gid HaNasheh, the sciatic nerve. And so Eiberschutz and his followers were following along in that tradition. And that put them beyond the pale as far as Emden was concerned. Meat is articulated as one of the significant transgressions, that is the consumption of meat and parts of the animal that really affirm his status as a heretic. Emden says it's public knowledge that anyone who has eaten the meat that Eiberschutz had porged, that meat entered his body like snake venom. So it was also dangerous. It wasn't just a religious transgression. It wasn't just a moral and ethical transgression, but it's really like snake venom. And it's meat that Emden considered not kosher. And of course, Eiberschutz, so the point isn't lost, would only eat his own meat because he found that to be the highest grade of kosher meat. He was the only person he could trust. So kashrut is really in the eye of the consumer, that is, whoever eats it.
Well, I want to explore this question. You raised it earlier, and maybe it's an intersection between anthropology and history. You said correctly that if you're asking a rabbi or a Jewish law expert, are there different gradations of kosher? They would say, no, of course not. There's kosher and non-kosher. And yet, I think that if you stopped pretty much any Jew on the street of America today, probably including Orthodox Jews, but certainly others, and you said, are some foods more or less kosher than others? They would say, yes, absolutely, of course. Pork is the most unkosher, and then probably shellfish is a close second. And then, maybe they would say probably a cheeseburger is worse. They would be completely kind of quote unquote wrong in the sense of any kind of halachic discourse. And yet I think they would be pretty sure that they were right. In a certain way, maybe they are right in the sense that that's what the wider society kind of understands it to be. I'm curious when we think about that and different societies. Like, I guess what I'm describing is true as I experience it of American society in the 21st century. But I'm wondering to what extent, I may not be using the language correctly, but the sort of anthropological notion of how that society relates to meat at all or thinks about meat. I'm even thinking about that in English, we use kind of a euphemism, although maybe it comes from some ancient English kind of thing, but we say meat, whereas in German or Yiddish, they say Fleisch. And that really is much more descriptive of what it really is, the flesh of the animal. And in societies that sort of think of meat differently than other societies, what else happens? And in some ways, I'm also wondering if some of the Jewish history of Germany, which at some points flourished and at some points was the worst it's ever been, could in any way be connected to the way that they think about meat.
Well, first of all, let me just pick up on your first point. You're absolutely right. There's halacha, and then there's popular perceptions. And there's no doubt, absolutely, that people would put pork at the top of the list. There's absolutely no doubt. And pork is different. There's a whole history why the pig is considered especially taboo. And I think that that's very important. I don't think just because something doesn't conform to halachic standards, if the overwhelming majority of Jews were to say that there's something special or particular about pig, I think that's to be respected. If you're asking anthropologically about the place of meat, I mean, different societies obviously have different relations to meat. There are cultures that don't consume meat at all. There are cultures that consume meat that consume certain parts of the animal in a sort of an elaborate ceremony in particular order. Judaism and Islam, of course, are meat-eating cultures, but they have a taboo against pig. But the dietary laws in Judaism are so all-encompassing and so complex that meat takes on a level of importance because they are the very, very heart of kashrut. They are at the very heart of the dietary laws. So, there's no such thing as a non-kosher vegetable, fruit, those things are all kosher. It's meat that poses the challenge. I think that in itself warrants a book. I mean, obviously there is halakha in this book, and I speak about Jewish law, et cetera, but that's not the main thrust. The main thrust is the social and particularly cultural place of meat within Judaism and the way those laws are perceived by the Christian other. And meat takes on many, many different forms. It's, we're speaking about meat as though it's only something that can be consumed, but it can be formed in art, in text, in poetry, in prose, satire, law. Meat makes all sorts of appearances because of its absolute centrality to the Jewish diet.
Let's run with that, because for folks who don't eat meat, that last sentence could be a challenge, and your book goes into this. Your book goes into vegetarianism from a number of perspectives that I, as somebody who is myself a vegetarian, found both really interesting and inspiring and also like terrifying and catastrophically awful. Because we're talking about a place, Germany, where some incredibly prominent vegetarians were also incredibly prominent Nazis. And not sort of incidentally. The vegetarianness of many high-level Nazis, of Hitler, was not just like, oh, I happen to be a vegetarian. It related to his philosophy of understanding the world. I want to open up the vegetarian side, but not starting with the Nazis, but rather starting with the Jewish Enlightenment, or the Enlightenment period through the prism of Jews, because that's where the inspiring piece was for me. I was riveted by a section of your book that explored two figures who were both vegetarian, but like disagreed with each other about everything else. One, I'm forgetting their names, but one was like a very sort of traditionalist-minded Jew, not as excited about reforms that were happening during the Enlightenment, and the other was very much somebody who let's think differently about Jewish law. Let's shift the ways we've related to our liturgy and our practices. Can you take us a little bit into the Enlightenment period? Because that's a moment where I've heard basically nobody talk about meat in that. I've heard people talk about, there's this guy Mendelssohn and Geiger and Samson Raphael Hirsch. Like I've heard, for some of our listeners that are familiar with tellings of Jewish history, those names might be familiar. I have not heard their thoughts about meat. But when I did from you, some new avenues opened up to me. So how did relationships to the food we eat, to the meat we eat, to kashrut generally play a role in that pivotal moment in shifts to Jewish practice?
Okay, so Germany presents itself as unique on this subject, that is the subject of Jews and meat, insofar as the Jews in Germany were not an emancipated people. They were not emancipated until 1871, really quite late. The debates over emancipation begin in the middle of the 18th century and drag on. And the Jews are emancipated in Prussia in 1812, and then it's rescinded in 1815, and emancipated again, 1848, and it's rescinded in 18. So it's a stop and start kind of process. But in the 18th century, when the debates were beginning as to whether the Jews should or should not be emancipated, Germany's the only place where meat is brought into the debates as to whether Jews can be emancipated. And there were those who focused on the meats that Jews eat, and in particular the meats that they refuse to eat, as being disqualifying for citizenship, because they cannot sit at table with us, is what one of them said. We cannot form friendships and bonds because they won't sit down and eat with us. This was a professor of Hebrew Bible, I might add, at the University of Göttingen, doggedly opposed to Jewish emancipation, Johann David Michaelis, who said that we have developed a learned disgust for each other's foods. There's an intersection here between the notion of citizenship and meat consumption, citizenship and the dietary laws, as precluding the possibility of Jews becoming not just citizens, but becoming German. Because what was raised, of course, is that the laws of kashrut are ancient. They are very ancient. They're born in the ancient Near East. And so the view about Jews was, of course, that they are themselves not European. Their customs are not European. They are Oriental. So that becomes a theme in the emancipation debates. The other thing that Germany doesn't really have an analogy anywhere else is that Germany has what's called a life reform movement, Lebensreform, and it's a very loose collection of vegetarians, anti-vaccination campaigners, anti-vivisection campaigners, teetotalers, anti-smokers, clothing reformers, advocates for hiking and exercise and gymnastics. That was an ecumenical movement. There were Jews in it, there were non-Jews, Catholics, Protestants, people from the upper classes, people from the lower classes. It's all over the social map. But there is one strain of vegetarianism in Germany that has anti-Semitism as its core and what binds its adherents. It's in the 19th century, and they are purveyors of what becomes called folkish ideology, and it's the ideology of the folk. It's sort of a right-wing ethno-nationalist ideology that entails vegetarianism, worshipping of the Aryan body, sometimes Germanic, pre-Christian Germanic religions. And the pre-Christian is important because for these people, Christianity stems from Judaism. So as to purge Judaism from the religious life of Germany, they went to sort of pre-Christian traditions. And at the heart of this were, some of the most prominent anti-Semites of the late 19th century in Germany, political figures, but also important cultural figures, the most important being Wagner. Wagner himself was not really dedicated to vegetarianism, although he decried the excesses of the bourgeoisie. And the excesses of the bourgeoisie manifested itself, as far as he was concerned, in a huge amount of meat eating. And meat being very central to the German diet just in general. But the Jews, for him, typified the excesses of the bourgeoisie. In the circle around him, he was in the town of Bayreuth, and what was called the Bayreuth Circle, his disciples, and there were many sort of, anti-Semitic vegetarians around them. And many of them blamed Jews for introducing meat eating and the meat eating practices of the Jews to the world and upset civilization as such. That's an idea they got from Schopenhauer on the basis of morality, which was a text he wrote in 1840, and when he spoke about the lack of respect shown for animal rights, which was a barbarous thing, he said, and has its origins in Judaism. And what he was referring to was kosher slaughter. There's a whole universe of what looked like, crackpots, but they were very, very influential. And Hitler, of course, eventually credited Wagner with his own turn to vegetarianism.
It's strange that when you ask Jews who think a lot about kosher slaughter, for example, why Judaism has kosher slaughter, they will almost universally say that it's a more humane way to slaughter. And yet criticism of kosher slaughter is often one that's saying it's not humane. And I wonder whether that really represents two just divergent understandings of what's humane, or whether in both cases or in one or the other of the cases, it tends to be not honest. It's not really what it's about. And in the case of those who say that kosher slaughter is not humane, it's often driven by anti-Semitism. And in the case of those who say, maybe the Jews who say that it is humane, actually the reason why they're doing it is because they believe that that's what God told them to do. And it's not really because it's humane. Do you have a take on that?
Well, I think I eat meat, but I can say just killing an animal, whichever way you're killing it, is not humane. It's a violent act. But because the two most perhaps important rituals in Judaism involve bloodletting and knives, circumcision and shchita, kosher animal slaughter, there is a view, an anti-Semitic view, that Jews have a predilection towards bloodletting and cruelty, general ghastliness when it comes to the shedding of blood. And of course, the Jewish response to that, the Jewish retort to that was, no, the way you Christians kill your animals, that's violent, that's inhumane, and that's cruel. And I have a chapter on this in the book. But because of the campaign against kosher slaughter in the 19th century, we see something happen in Germany, again, that we don't see elsewhere, and that is the engagement of German Jews for the first time in politics and political lobbying. And this gets us back to the comment that Lex made early on, that it's not just a story of anti-Semitism. So in the context of this sort of anti-Semitic assault on kosher slaughter in Germany, with the charges of excessive cruelty, and of course, always going back to the Middle Ages, whenever there was a ritual murder charge, it was always the butcher who was accused, because he had the tools apparently and the anatomical knowledge. That's what was always said.
Means motive and opportunity.
Exactly.
It's like the butler did it, but you just change two letters from CH to L. Butcher, butler.
Yeah. Exactly. Very good. So in this campaign in the 19th century, which was conducted by anti-Semitic political parties, these are not parties that happen to have anti-Semites in them. Their entire raison d'etre, they refer to themselves as the anti-Semitic bloc in the parliament. They had one agenda item, and that was the Jews. They formed common cause with animal rights societies to try and outlaw kosher slaughter. What's interesting about Germany is that attempt to render kosher slaughter illegal failed time and time and time again, because Jewish lobbying of members of parliament, the liberals, and especially the Catholic Centre Party came to the assistance and the aid of the Jews. And so they had allies in the parliament. And the arguments that they made repeatedly is that Germany, at both the state level and at the national level, in the state constitutions and in the national constitution, always guaranteed freedom of religion. And any attempt to ban kosher slaughter would infringe upon the constitutionally guaranteed right to the free practice of religion in Germany. And those forces that tried so desperately and so relentlessly to get rid of kosher slaughter failed time and time and time again. That's a very positive side of this story, that in the context of this sort of anti-Semitic assault, you had real allies who came, and Germany stood up, as it were. They were not able to really pass that legislation until they were able to. And that comes later on in the 20th century.
Wow. So this is really, really an incredible lens into so many different moments in German Jewish history. I have a closing question, and it's admittedly very broad, but I'd love to hear let's pretend we lived in a world where your book didn't exist, and even any study of the role of meat in Jewish history, the role of food production in Jewish history was, I was going to say slaughtered, was cast aside. What would we miss? In a world where your book doesn't exist, what would we miss out? And which is effectively the same question as why, what uniquely does the study of meat bring to our collective consciousness that we could not glean otherwise? Why is this book, why is this work, why are others doing similar work so important to our collective understanding?
So you can't really understand Jewish culture without appreciating the centrality of the dietary laws for most Jews, for most of our history. So that in itself is essential. It intersects with issues to do with Jewish law, Jewish self-perceptions, and the way Jews are seen. That's the other side of the story. And how meat allows Jews to perceive non-Jews. It's not just Jews being looked at, but Jews seeing their non-Jewish neighbors and what it was that they ate, and how their meat defines their values. The other thing is very obvious, and it's so obvious that it's not of particular interest to most historians. That is to say, eating is just so essential. we do it a few times a day, but to the point where it's not for many. I mean, there is food history now, and that's a legitimate field of engagement. But within Jewish historiography, that hasn't really found its place. What I tried to demonstrate in this book is that you can tell a story that intersects in all sorts of ways. So just one other way, science. Science comes into it that won't come into it in studies of meat sort of earlier on. But in the campaign to get rid of kosher slaughter in the 19th century, Jews went to the Jewish scientists, veterinarians went to European slaughterhouses to observe and record exactly what they saw. It engages science in that respect. And of course, when we get to the end, towards the end of the story, I mentioned before that meat became sort of political fodder in Germany towards the end of the 19th century, where the anti-Semitic parties and the animal rights societies took up the cause to get rid of it. But in around 1925, once we have Nazis this was before Hitler comes to power, but there are already the Nazi parties exist, and there are Nazis in sort of state parliaments. They take up the cause again, and they begin to enjoy some success at the local level. But the goal was always to have a national ban. Hitler comes to power January the 30th, 1933. April the 21st, 1933, they get rid of kosher slaughter. So it's a measure of just how important it was that 11 weeks after he becomes Chancellor of Germany, and he signed the order, he was the first of 4 signatories. And so it's a measure of just how high on the persecutory agenda that Nazis had ranked the elimination of kosher slaughter. And that sets off great difficulties, and immediately sort of heart-wrenching advertisements that one finds that I talk about in the book, that in the Orthodox press, because hundreds of Jewish butchers are suddenly out of work. And they have families to support, and they're desperately looking for work. So it's a whole sector of the Jewish economy. And of course, their customers are in dire straits because of the fact that they can't get kosher meat. Now, they can still get kosher meat until 1938, if it comes from Holland or it comes from Denmark. And they had to go to the borders and pick it up at border stops. But the community was completely absorbed by the question of what are we going to do for those in hospital, those in nursing homes, Jewish hospitals, because meat at that time was considered the best and the most irreplaceable source of protein. And so there was a real fear. So we read in the communal records this constant concern with the welfare of the community's most vulnerable members. But the book finishes on the return of kosher meat to Germany in the DP camps and the work of aid organizations, particularly the American Joint Distribution Committee, to bring kosher meat back to Germany for the 250,000 DPs. So it's a huge number of people.
Displaced persons, for those who
displaced persons who lived in DP camps, displaced persons camps, who survivors hadn't eaten meat in years in many cases. And it was a step on the road to returning to some kind of normality. It's a whole story, but it takes us through to the post-war period, and meat, the return of kosher meat to Germany is part of the story, as much a part of the story as the banning of kosher meat under the Nazis.
Thank you so much, John Efron, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
I've enjoyed it, and I thank you very much for inviting me on.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As we close out, 2 quick reminders. First, we've got a bouncing baby child in the family of Judaism Unbound podcasts. That's the Oral Talmud podcast, not a human child, but a podcast child. We hope that you will enjoy this new creation, the Oral Talmud podcast, in any podcast listening app that you desire. It's available in all of them. The trailer just dropped, and soon, on June 23rd, we will have our first few episodes of the Oral Talmud podcast released to the world. So don't miss them. Subscribe in Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever podcast listening app you like. Don't miss the Oral Talmud. Also, time is running out to apply for Judaism Unbound's certificate program in Unbound Judaism with the Unyeshiva. Cohort 3 applications are open right now, but they won't be for much longer. They close on Sunday, June 22nd. So get those applications in. You can get all the info at judaismunbound.com/certificate and then submit your application. So we hope that you will consider signing up for this ongoing course of study where you get to experience lots of Jewish learning and unlearning in a transgeographic community of incredible unbound Jews all around the country and the world. Those shout outs concluded. We, of course, are always interested in hearing from you. We hope that you will be in touch via any of the following forms of contact. You can send us an email at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. You can visit our Facebook or Instagram pages. Both of those are at Judaism Unbound for our handles. Send us a message there. You can always head to our website, judaismunbound.com. Check out show notes for this episode, all sorts of other resources. And we are so grateful when you are able to support us financially on either a monthly recurring basis or via a one-time gift. If you're interested in particular in channeling your financial support towards sponsoring an episode of Judaism Unbound, you can just be in touch with us at hello, HELLO, at judaismunbound.com. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.